Hello. So I'll preface this by saying I'm from the South and I drink a lot of Red Bull, so I tend to talk pretty fast. So if I'm going too fast or not making sense, please just like hold your arms up and wave them around really, really fast, and I will try to slow down. But that's a pretty big coffee, so I don't know. Might be trying to sweep back the tide. So hello, I'm Billy Hoffman. I'm here to talk about automating performance testing inside of Preprod using open source tools. I hate finding out about performance problems in production. Who here, maybe more on the ops side, has ever gotten a Slack or a PagerDuty notification or something like that saying system in production is down? Yes, it sucks, right? Who here has ever had to be on call, right, over a holiday or a weekend? Sucks. And then you find out something went down, and it's kind of like, yeah, that's totally a problem, and you should fix that. But somehow it's even worse when it's a self-inflicted wound, when it's not something, backhoe through the fiber or something beyond your control, but it's, hey, you guys rolled out a new version of the site and some esoteric part of it broke. Or, hey, there was a failure, you did a restore from backup, and it was an older config, and now you're starting to have connectivity or performance issues. I kind of liken it to turning on your faucet and seeing brown water. It's like, congratulations, like I could call, Atlanta City Water and tell them this. That would be the equivalent of your users telling you your site is slow. But the ideal is that somewhere upstream, literally upstream in this case, at the water treatment plant, they catch this and they know that there's a problem before it gets to me. So the sort of approach here with performances is why are we not doing sort of performance testing before things go live? Now, usually, as soon as you explain this to people, they get it. Yes, you should be doing some sort of monitoring, be the canary in the coal mine in production so that, if something happens, you know about it and you respond. And we're always going to need to do that because it's not first-party content that's often a problem. It can be, that Optimizely script on your website, or it could be, hey, you're running something through MuleSoft and they're having problems. So you'll always need to do production monitoring, but people get pretty quickly, hey, we should probably do some sort of performance assessments as part of the release criteria before we push something out the door. And almost always what people start saying is like, oh, I know, like we'll build it, and sort of as part of the acceptance testing that maybe the product management organization does, yeah, we'll just make sure that it's fast and we'll make it fast, right? As if performance is paint, right? You can take an almost completed product and just slap a little magic performance paint on it and suddenly it's fast. No, you can't do that. Performance is something that has to be designed, built, and tested into the system throughout the entire process. And when we think about this, performance problems, often they're just really cute bugs. Cute bugs that get you woken up in the middle of the night, but bugs nonetheless. So a bug, by definition, is unintended program behavior. So unintended program behavior is, yeah, instead of a zip code, I put a SQL injection input stream into your web form, and pow, now I own your database. Like, yes, that is unintended program behavior that also happens to have security implications, but it's also unintended behavior. Well, same thing with performance. If you've got a designer who's tweaking, say, an image carousel, or you're rolling out a new, calendaring widget or something like that, and they make a mistake and they introduce maybe some blocking JavaScript calls instead of some deferred JavaScript calls, and suddenly start render or visually complete or some of the other important metrics are now taking longer, that was unintended behavior. Somebody made a mistake. I see this actually a lot when I work with media sites where the app is great, ops is great, and they all complain about the content team that's shoving 25 meg ping images into the CMS, and you can just slowly see the hero image load. Somebody made a mistake. They forgot to export something from Photoshop properly. So that's by definition, if you think of these like bugs, it makes a lot of sense. There are big bugs and there are small bugs in terms of functional bugs. There's also big performance problems and smaller performance problems. But if you start thinking about performance problems as bugs and treat them as such and go through a triage process just like you would any other sort of critical defect, it allows you to start slotting them into your normal development process, right? Hey, let's go ahead and figure out what we're going to work on in this sprint. Hey, let's prioritize the backlog. Hey, we've given this thing a severity and we're tracking it in Jira or whatever it is that you happen to be using. So reframing this as bugs actually helps the process of integrating it in as something you do throughout the process. Now, the other great thing here, who here has heard of the mythical ManMonth? Oh, thank God. You have no idea how often I go to a conference and say that, and like 2 people raise their hand, and part of me dies a little inside. So the great thing is that we have literally decades of research. We don't have to figure this out. Fred Brooks figured this out for us in the 70s, that if you do testing early and often in the life cycle, you find and fix problems earlier, and it's cheaper and easier to fix them. In fact, the worst thing to do is to wait until it goes out into production and triggers a performance outage or a performance issue in production, and then you're getting alerted, and you then have to, engineers are already off on the next set of tasks. You have to stop, they have to reproduce the issue, they have to verify. Like, it's way more expensive. The fastest bug you can ever fix is developer is typing in, their text editor or their IDE of choice, and they're like, type, 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 type. Oh, wait a minute, I'm an idiot. Backspace, 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 right? Like, that's the cheapest fix for a bug you're ever gonna find. That happens very rarely, right? Usually developers, they have to compile and then they realize, oh crap, I made a mistake. Or they start running their smoke tests and they go, oh wait, I made a mistake. But the farther you get from the creation of the bug, the longer it takes to fix. And Fred Brooks already figured this out for us. Same thing applies for performance issues. The farther away you get from, hey, developers tweaking the templates for a product description page on an e-com site, or maybe the category page on a new CMS, and they've introduced blocking JavaScript calls, or hey, I'm going to use a font, but actually I'm referencing the font directly origin. I'm not referencing it through, say, the CDN. So wow, now it's taking longer to load. They made a mistake. You want to catch that as quickly as possible. So where should we integrate this across our amazing dev cycle? And everyone has slightly different dev cycles. Some people do certain parts of this. Some of them may be automated. Some of them may be manual. But typically, you have a developer writing some code in an IDE and testing on localhost. You have some sort of check-in and code review process. This may literally be somebody reviewing a pull request. This could be somebody actually downloading a branch and doing a little review. It could be any number of ways. At some point, you have some sort of system where it's getting published to a staging environment. Basically, we kind of call this like the thing is deployed somewhere and you can manually test it. Or there's the whole process that gets kicked off to actually switch a thing from being in pre-prod to being in production. You can really do performance assessing anywhere in this process. How many people have pulled up Chrome DevTools on localhost and looked at a waterfall chart and said, oh crap, I just made a mistake, right? Congratulations, you're doing performance testing in the development phase. Good job. How many people have ever integrated, say, like Google Lighthouse into a CI/CD system? How many people here are using Google Lighthouse by chance? It's pretty cool. You should check it out. It essentially is assessing you for certain types of best practices. But you can really integrate anywhere. Now, as you get further left, the tools tend to be more diverse, and integrating into them tend to be more diverse. I'm a big fan of staging, because if it's in staging, basically wherever you do any type of manual QA, everyone says all of their QA is automated and their test coverage is awesome, and I find that rarely is true. Often they will say that, but it's not, and they'll say they don't do manual testing, but they almost always have, yeah, at a certain point, an intern bangs on something deployed on an internal environment. But that's a good place to do it, because it kind of means, look, we're not dealing with multiple parallel branches. We're sort of dealing with, this is the thing that will soon be production. Everybody sort of assess it. That's a good place to do it. So if you're going to be doing performance testing to make sure that you don't create problems in production, what should you be looking for? I'm a big fan of user experience metrics, timing metrics, performance budgets, and specific defects. So let's talk about each of these. What do I mean by UX metrics? I mean things that are essentially the rendering and what the user is experiencing. So how many people here know speed index? Hopefully, awesome. So speed index is, I love it because I got to try to explain calculus to people at our company that had not taken calculus, because speed index is essentially the rate at which the page is being drawn. But how quickly does the page render? How quickly does above the fold content complete? The rate at which that happens is speed index. There are fun and very confusingly named metrics like time to first meaningful paint, time to first contentful paint, which are not the same thing for some very silly reason. But these are all different metrics that essentially gauge what is the user seeing and how quickly is it reacting. When is the page, time to interactive is another good one, which is different than DOM interactive, but time to interactive is like, hey, when is the thread that can process my click events and available and idle. But all of these are different metrics that sort of measure how the user is experiencing it. Now, there are literally dozens and dozens of different types of metrics you can use. Typically, it depends on what you're doing. A lot of the companies that I work with that are media customers, they care basically about like start render and visually complete, like above the fold content stuff, and they don't really care about window.onload or anything later, because that's when all the third parties fire. They can't do anything about those. We find that e-com sites, they care a lot about like time to interactive. So whatever it is, if you probably know what metrics you care about. If you don't, go talk to the analytics team at your company if you have one that's tracking maybe conversion rates on a call to action, so you can kind of figure out. But basically, figure out which metric is appropriate to you and track it, but knowing what the user experience is key. Another thing is timings. Again, it can depend on what you care about. Maybe you do care about onload. Maybe you care about fully loaded. How many people here are using user timings, custom user timings in the browser? How many people know about them? So this is really cool. This is, you can just do window.performance.mark. It's a way from JavaScript in the client. You basically can drop a pin to measure an event. So let's say I'm a media site and I don't really care about like when the page starts rendering, and I don't really care about like when window.onload fires. I want to know, when does this div that's going to contain an ad, when does that paint? Well, it's really easy in your JavaScript to just say, hey, I'm about to make a call to the third-party ad provider and measure that, and then, hey, I got the response back. Let me calculate how long that took. So that's what custom user timings lets you do in the browser, and it basically just lets you align and track sort of more businessy metrics than sort of events the browser's just spitting out. But if those are important to you, those are obviously things you should be tracking. If I'm, going back to that example, the media company that has, they track time to first ad, that's what's up on their sort of their dashboard, and that's what they're using in Jenkins to decide whether they should pass or fail a build, is did time to first ad get better or get worse? I'm a big fan of performance budgets. So performance budgets is just like how much content was there and how many requests did it take to get all that content to the browser. But I'm a really big fan of looking at content by type and also trying to separate out first-party content from third-party content. A lot of times you'll see, wow, somebody from marketing just added a whole bunch of trackers onto the site. And so like, why is, if you're just looking at first-party content, you'll see, oh yeah, I'm still loading maybe 1 or 2 megs worth of content. But if you look at all of the content, you realize, holy crap, we're downloading 10 megs of content because they just added a whole bunch of third-party calls and they're pulling in a lot of content. So the other thing is part of your testing is test with different devices. Responsive websites are great, and progressive web apps are great, but I can't tell you the number of times I've seen a mobile site make the same number of requests and go download the exact same assets that the desktop site loads. And so it's a responsive site in that the image shrinks, but you're still going and grabbing an image that's 3 megs in size, which is kind of silly. They're not using source sets the way they should. So tracking performance budgets is really important. Also, track specific problems. How many people here have ever heard of a guy named Steve Souders by chance? Awesome. So Steve Souders, he wrote a book. This is an O'Reilly book. It's about 10 years old. It is still amazingly relevant, which is, hey, it's not so much the back end of websites that make things slow, it's the front end. It's all that, getting all that, the fonts, the CSS, the JavaScript, the images, the markup, all of that crap down and rendered in the browser. And so there are specific best practices that we should know. For example, literally, this is an example from this week, somebody had, instead of a hero image, they had a hero video, which is fairly common. People will do that now. And I noticed that the video was 25 megs. I'm like, why is this so big? And I looked at the markup, and it was like, HTML video tag, and there was a muted attribute on it, and I'm like, why are they muting it? It's a background image. It shouldn't have sound, or it's a background video. It shouldn't have sound. This 25 meg video had 8 megs of audio. that was in the MP4 that was getting downloaded by the browser and never actually played. So that is not a good best practice. That is bad. You are downloading a whole lot of content that's never actually going to get used. So we have an idea of what these best practices are. If you've ever used a tool like PageSpeed Insights or YSlow, who here has ever heard of those tools? Awesome. So those are testing for certain front-end performance best practices, right? Do you have JavaScript that's blocking the rendering? Are you pulling in fonts from a third party? Are you downloading most of your resources from a CDN, but some of your resources are not being downloaded from a CDN. So there are very specific examples or things that you should be looking at. So hey, you've got a whole bunch of JavaScript that's all being served from the same host, and you're not using HTTP2, so it's having to make a bunch of round trips back and forth, which are delaying the page loading. So you want to test for specific violations of best practices. So if either the timing metrics are bad or you're detecting specific problems, you probably want to try to say, hey, this, our assessment of this site during the development process, it's probably failed. This is not good. It's a regression. It's a performance problem. Call it whatever you want to call it. But how do you define that? Well, for specific defects that we were talking about, like say an MP4 file that's not optimized for streaming, that's pretty obvious. The MP4 is either structured properly for streaming or it's not, and the browser has to make 3 different HTTP requests before it can actually start playing the video. Or, for example, the 25 meg video. Or, for example, in this case, this is an image. This was actually on an e-com site where it's a photograph, but they saved it as a ping. They made a mistake, and it should be a JPEG. And so in this case, we see it's a 400K ping, but it should be about 93K JPEG. So somebody just made a mistake. But you probably want to have thresholds. It's not just enough that the defect exists. Sometimes the defect has to be bad. So don't tell me that there's a bunch of images on my site that were not exported properly from Photoshop. Tell me that they have to be at least this bad. Like, I don't want to know about that I can save 2K off of a font file. Tell me when I have a font file that I can save 200K off of. So often when you're detecting specific defects, you want to tweak the thresholds. And for these open source projects like YSlow and PageSpeed, you can go in and actually manually edit the rules to make them flag at certain points. So rules are pretty easy because it's either there or it's not, or it has to be a certain severity or it's not. How do you fail on metrics? Well, a lot of times people say absolute, right? Like, tell me if my page is ever loading in more than 25 seconds or 30 seconds, or tell me if start render takes more than 1 second. Absolute thresholds are great, but relative thresholds are also very important, especially when used as part of a pre-prod environment, because you may say, look, I don't ever want this thing to load slower than 20 seconds. And great, it's loading in 5 seconds, so you're doing great. But maybe you want to know, hey, have I gotten 15% worse over the last 2 weeks as I've been doing this sprint? So often what I find is when you're assessing the performance of a site and you've measured, say, its start render performance, look at the last build and be like, what is this number relative to the last build? What is this number relative to the trailing 3 days, right? Or let me compare 2 dev cycles ago and see how it's doing. So all of these are important, but having some sort of relative measurement so that you make sure that you're not slowly drifting over time, in addition to absolute metrics, is really important. So we know what you should be testing for, right? You should be measuring the experience or measuring timings, really whichever ones make sense for your business. And you should be looking for specific best practice violations to essentially assess whether you're doing this. How should you actually automate this as part of the process? We talked about this, and as I said, it helps to sort of integrate at the QA testing phase. And it ends up looking like this. You end up having some sort of an event or a trigger. Maybe this is somebody checking in code. So you go ahead and you grab the branch, you do a build, and you deploy to staging. At that point, you want to kick off synthetic tests. So synthetic tests are like, hey, go spin up a headless version of Chrome or a headless version of Firefox and assess how quickly things were loading. And you want to take the results of that and then compare it with historic information to basically figure out like, how am I doing, yes or no. And as soon as you start doing that, you're able to start saying, hey, did start render performance get worse than some absolute threshold? Or looking at the historic context, is it worse than, say, the trailing 2 dev cycles? And you could mark it as fail, and fail, say, the build. Or if that passes, then you want to start looking for specific defects, right? And assuming all of that, then you can pass it as good. So what do you do with the output, right? Is this thing a fail? Is this thing a pass? You probably want to go put that data somewhere. So you want to annotate the pull request in GitHub. You want to create a new issue in Jira. Maybe you want to post to an ops channel in Slack or a build system channel in Slack. But given that this is the model, what's sort of the open source software that we can overlay on top of this to accomplish it? Luckily, there's a ton of it. How many people here have heard of Webpage Test by chance? Excellent. So more of you should go and take a look at this. So there's a great website called webpagetest.org. It allows you to put in a URL, and it will run from either any location you want. It's a community project. It'll spin up, say, Chrome 65 in Virginia and measure your site and then tell you all of the stats. Hey, it took 1 second to load, or it took 1 second to start rendering. It took 3 seconds before you had DOM content loaded, 5 seconds until you had window.onload. It captures a film strip of how it loaded. It can capture a video. It can give you a waterfall chart of how everything loads. So Webpage Test is a great way to sort of kick off how does a browser load this thing that I just built. And they have something that's called Webpage Test Private Instance, which is essentially a way for you to take, say, an Amazon AMI or something like that, and basically spin up your own private instance of Webpage Test. Excuse me. That's very helpful for testing things inside the firewall, right? So things that are, internal inside your organization, you just have your own private instance of Webpage Test. And again, entirely open source. Your trigger, maybe it's coming from GitHub, maybe it's coming from a build system. Maybe, honestly, it's just, you actually can kick off these analyses. Webpage Test API they just have a RESTful API. So you could use curl to basically say, hey, Webpage Test, go start assessing staging.mycompany.com, right, and collect the metrics. It's very helpful to take this information and store it somewhere. So I'm a big fan of InfluxDB, but you either can store your own information, and remember, the reason we're storing past results is we're wanting that historic context. We're wanting hey, the page is still loading quickly, and it's loading faster than 8 seconds, but when you started this sprint, this thing was loading in 3 seconds, and now it's loading in 6. So it hasn't tripped your absolute threshold yet, but clearly during this dev cycle, you guys have introduced some issues that have made whatever metric it is you care about slower. So to do that, you need to have some sort of data store to store the historic context. You can do this with Influx, or you can cheat. How many people here have heard of the HTTP archive by chance? Awesome. You guys should totally go check this out. httparchive.org. It's a site that's it's managed by a bunch of people. Google contributes. But every month, twice a month, they run the Alexa Top Million through a whole bunch of Webpage Test instances and basically record and say, yeah, your typical web page is making 115 requests. It's loading this amount of content. Here's how many fonts they have. Here is the typical start render time. Basically, they're aggregating a whole lot of metrics. So at the very least, you can go consult the HTTP archive, which is accessible via an API, to say, hey, look, you just assessed the performance of this app that you guys are going to end up rolling into production. Right now, it's loading in, it's starting to render in 2 seconds. How does that compare to the typical internet? Oh, I'm better than most of the internet? Fantastic. Oh, wait, I'm not? Okay, crap. Maybe I should use that to fail the build. So using Webpage Test to sort of collect that information and then using a historic context is a great way to kind of say, am I getting better or am I getting worse? Then to look for specific defects, you can leverage open source tools like YSlow, PageSpeed Insights, or even Google Lighthouse. So some of these are actually built into Webpage Test. You can just check a little box, and while it's collecting your how the page loads and giving you all that information, it'll also go ahead and do some basic best practices checks. So that's another great way to say, hey, we were loading this page and we noticed it was slow, and by the way, here is a HTTP compression problem, which you would be surprised in 2018. You would be amazed at how often you'll see, hey, here's a site, everything's going great, but it's not loading, maybe a font using compression, or sometimes you see the inverse, and it's like, wow, why did this site get slower? Oh, for some reason, it's taking all of its images and also trying to compress them. So whenever you see like, oh, content type JPEG and content encoding gzip, that's a mistake. Those are the types of things that you can look for. And these tools like Lighthouse, YSlow, Webpage Test, and PageSpeed Insights, they already do some of that for you and can plug in as well. And so that's giving you sort of your 50,000-foot view of, am I getting better or worse? And do I have specific defects? And then allows you to decide, hey, is this a pass or a fail? And then to contact a webhook for Slack to post the results, or to Jira to update an epic. So you can do this with open source software. I'm not a salesy guy, but I think the salesy guys would yell at me if I didn't say that's actually what our company does, is kind of automate that. But personally, I'm a big fan of doing it with open source. And when you've done this and then you don't want to have to manage it anymore, go find a vendor who can do it for you. But dear God, please, if you're not doing any sort of performance assessments in pre-prod, please do it using open source to start. There's actually a really great article up on Median. If you just search for housing.com and continuous integration using Webpage Test and Webpack, this is a phenomenal article. It's a ground-up, step-by-step guide about how they did it internally. And I think it's going to contain a lot of the really good examples of, all right, here is the exact code you want to use when you're configuring this webhook, which don't really make for very interesting presentations if I included code snippets in it. But this is a really great guide for it. So what are some gotchas? That's great. I made some pretty, well, I wouldn't say pretty. I made some art in Google Slides, and it seemed to show an ideal process. We'll just leave DevOps Day Seattle, and you guys on Monday will go and do that, and then realize that there are gotchas, because there's always gotchas. It's not that easy. So the first thing is what do we mean by staging? Really, when I mean staging, I really just mean any sort of common pre-prod environment. It's got to be stable. It's got to be roughly consistent and functional. And yes, you can still test. You should test. When you're testing, remember how I showed the whole process? I'm like, oh, at localhost, you totally can test. You can totally test on localhost, right, with like Google DevTools. The problem is with localhost, your site looks amazing. Well, of course it looks amazing. It's localhost, right? And even if you turn on network throttling, right, it's not as accurate. And so staging, having something that is similar to production, it doesn't have to be the same thing, right? A lot of people think, oh, my staging environment has to mirror my production environment. It doesn't. It can be smaller. And actually, I believe that actor just died this week, so that's in really bad taste. I'm sorry. I did really enjoy Austin Powers back in the day, so maybe it's a tribute. But much like Mini-Me, it doesn't have to be the same size as Dr. Evil, but it just needs to be similar to Dr. Evil. So keep staging similar to production. And so by that, I mean, if you have a load balancer in production, you should probably have you should have a load balancer in your pre-prod environment. Even if your load balancer has one web head behind it, that's okay. You still want that load balancer there, because how else are you going to know when you are doing your infrastructure as code and you updated your load balancer config that actually you just totally screwed up the algorithm and it's going to pound a thing? So that's an example of, it doesn't have to be at the same scale, but all the parts have to be there. We talked about third parties. This is actually a graph we were pulling up where marketing magically started to add a whole bunch of other content. So a lot of times in pre-prod and during the development process, everyone just thinks, oh, I'm going to test first-party content. How much time do I have? That turned off, so I got confused. I told you guys I talked fast. I warned you. A lot of times in pre-prod, people are focused on their code. They're thinking, oh, I'm working on this widget. Let me make sure that that's good. But the thing is that a lot of times they don't think about how your website or your web app or your API, it's not just your code, it's your code and how it interacts with all that other crap. So I've often seen people that say, hey, I've been working on this new image carousel, and I moved it to React, and everything still seems good. Not realizing that they are now loading maybe multiple versions of React and they're getting collisions. Or not realizing that the way they flip this over when it's actually in production with the third-party JavaScript calls, that actually things are getting delayed and certain things are not loading. So in pre-prod, while you're doing this testing, you absolutely need to be doing it not just against your content, but also third parties. Now, I work a lot with media sites, and they're like, oh yeah, we're doing our testing. And I'm like, well, ads are always a problem for media sites. Test with ads. And pretty much every third-party provider, even third parties that charge you money if you use them, they have some sort of development mode. Often it's something you throw in the query string, or it's a special header you add, or maybe you have to whitelist something inside their console. But there are ways to say, go tell Google AdWords, hey, I want to be loading Google AdWord ads in pre-prod, but don't be charging me for, if I have an automated test, a click-through, or maybe other ads that are charging you based on impressions. So you definitely need to include third parties, because otherwise you're going to be looking at pre-prod numbers and say, everything looks amazing, push it live, and then somebody gets a Slack at 2 o'clock in the morning because something is interfering with the Optimizely widget. The other thing is emulated network. We kind of talked about this of, waha, works for me on localhost, everything's super fast. Well, of course it's super fast. Often in pre-prod, you get, yep, everything's loading really quick. Well, of course it's loading really quick. You're inside the same VPC, in AWS, and your EC2 instance is like connected. The machines may literally be next to each other in the same rack, but otherwise, yeah, they're connected with a 10 gigabit Ethernet connection between the two of them. So yes, of course it's going to be fast. When you're doing this testing, you need to be doing it with the emulated network of your end users. So Webpage Test, all of these free tools, Chrome DevTools itself, they have a way when you're in that waterfall view to say, hey, I want to pretend to be this system. I will tell you, Webpage Tests, their default emulated network is a 5 megabit cable modem, 5 megabyte down, 1 megabyte up, which is a little outdated. The latest report that Akamai put out puts the typical US internet connection at 22 megabits down. So I'm sure everyone here has a way better one than that. And you look at like speedtest.net will sometimes put out tests. Those are often skewed because it's like, well, yeah, if you have fiber and you're taking an average, well, then the average will appear higher. This is a great thing if you fail statistics like I did and have to take it twice, and you learn the importance of, median versus average, and, taking out, 95th or 99th percentiles. But anyway, do your testing with the emulated network that most of your users use when they're accessing you. Another mistake I see people do, let's say I have an e-commerce site or I have a SaaS app, and they'll say, hey, every time we do a new check-in, I want you to test the login page, I want you to test the settings page, I want you to test, like, these are my 5 or 6 key pages. I want you to test and tell me if the performance of them are getting better or getting worse. That's great, but it's really not about testing the individual parts. It's about testing the flows and understanding how your users are using the site. So I liken this to, I want to find out whether a cake tastes good. So I look at the eggs and I say, yep, eggs are good. Flour's good. Milk's good. Sugar's good. Awesome. All the parts are good. All the parts can be good, and you can still have a really shitty cake. So it's not about the parts. It's about how the parts are blended together. So the equivalent of that in web apps is the flow. So it's not just your login page is great or your settings page is great. It's that I go log in, then I navigate to the settings page, then I update one of the fields in the settings page, and then I go somewhere else. Or on an e-commerce site, I click a category, I click a product, I click add to cart, and I walk through the process. You can't just test the individual pieces, you need to test a flow. Now, how many people here has ever used Selenium? Yes. Everyone uses Selenium, and I have yet to find somebody who loves it. But Selenium's a great way to record sort of automated tests. There's a whole lot of things that'll consume Selenium WebDriver tests. Unfortunately, Webpage Test is not one of them. Webpage Test has some pretty primitive scripting. It's very powerful. I kind of liken it to assembly, right? Like if you're used to writing C and you have to go write assembly, you kind of die a little inside. And the scripting of Webpage Test is a lot more, it's much more akin to very primitive, like go here and then do this. So it is doable. Obviously, commercial solutions will have better ones, or you can try to find a WebDriver component that can drive, say, how many people here have looked at Puppeteer, which is the thing that drives Google? So Chrome and Chromium, they have this really sexy debugging port that lets you basically send all sorts of commands to it, but that is Puppeteer is sort of a very high-level node framework for driving it. And so it's a lot easier to sort of test flows. But that's a key thing when you're testing in pre-prod. Don't just test the individual pieces. Test the most common flows. How do you know what the most common flows are? Go talk to your analytics people. You probably should know. If you're an engineer, you should know. And if you don't know, your product manager should definitely know. And if they don't know, you should probably fire that product manager and go talk to the analytics people who will definitely be able to tell you what does the flow in the funnel look like for the key parts of your app. Another thing that people forget is that even when you're testing in pre-prod and these devices are all probably in a similar environment, you're testing network throttling, you can have jitter, right? The network has jitter. And so often I'll see somebody say, oh my God, my build failed because it said I went from loading, start render in, it used to take me 3 seconds, and now start render took place at 100 milliseconds. Holy crap, that's fast. But the weight of the page dropped from 3 megs to 600 or 60K. Oh, well, I know what happened. You probably had a request for a CSS that, for whatever reason, failed, and so you didn't end up loading all these other assets, and so that's why it rendered really fast. So what we find, this is actually Webpage Test's configuration screen. When you're running and assessing the performance of a page, don't just do one test, because probably 9 times out of 10, you'll just have some random thing happen, right? Like Optimizely is taking a really long time to load, because that's a third party. You'll have some sort of weird thing that'll skew all your results. So what's really great is when you're spinning up these sort of browsers to make this assessment of the different timings, run 3 checks and then take the median, or run 2 and average them together. Just do something to try to get rid of the outliers, because otherwise you're going to start getting a lot of failed builds that have nothing to do with actually you making a mistake. It just happened to do with there was some random jitter while you were trying to go download a third-party asset. And that's it. I know we covered a lot here, but I probably should have had this as a summary slide, but basically, you should be doing performance testing throughout your development lifecycle. Performance is not paint that you can just magically brush on to a already completed product. Certainly people who are more on the ops side of things definitely hate it when they're sort of given a pig and then yelled at about why the website is so slow. It's like, you gave me a pig. What did you expect? Like, you can only make that pig go so fast. Again, I'm from the South. My metaphors are really kind of stereotypical, I apologize. But yeah, you can only make a pig go so fast. So you want to be doing this as part of your release process. It should be the performance and the experience of the app should be release criteria. The same way a VP of engineering wouldn't, presumably, never release without doing some form of automated testing or having an idea about whether there's some Sev1 bugs, and then be able to basically do an assessment and make an informed decision about whether they should push to production or not. Performance should be that too. And you can do this, entirely with open source tools. An event happens, you go ahead and do an automated build and deploy to some sort of static staging environment that does not have to mirror production in terms of scale, but should mirror production in terms of capabilities and the infrastructure pieces that are in place. You can use Webpage Test to test the most important flows, not just pages, but flows inside your app or site. You should compare those metrics against historic metrics, either metrics of your own site or leverage the HTTP archive to show you how you're doing relative to everybody else. And then you should not only look at metrics, but you should use things like webpage or PageSpeed Insights, YSlow, or even Google Lighthouse to detect specific violations of best practices, and use those to determine whether something is going to be a good experience before you release. And that's the end of that. Any questions?
We have time for like one question.
Oh wow,
Who
I
wants
went really
to be
long.
the one?
Who's the one?
Ah.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned Google Lighthouse. RA is making a pretty conservative effort to continue to work with that tool and Google to kind of make things better for digital there. But how do you make it event-driven and actually the kind of the output of that, which are hundreds of individual performance opportunities, to kind of cascade into actual events that people can take,
Great question. So 2 pieces. One, Google Lighthouse's problems are not your problems. I can't tell you the number of times I work with media companies and they're like, stop telling me to use a service worker. We don't leverage them. And for XYZ reason, it doesn't make sense. So specifically with Lighthouse, take it with a grain of salt. Some things are applicable to your app. Some things may not be applicable to your app. But specifically with Lighthouse, I like to say these are the rules that I think apply, and I just go ahead and pull them out of the JSON result. I just wrote like a little glue script. Look at this, or you could be very basic and say just look at the high-level score and see if the high-level score is changing, and if it is, annotate a link to the Lighthouse report in, say, the pull request or something like that. So you can go and dig in deeper to see if it's something that you actually care about.
Okay, one more hand for Billy, please.